Welcome to everyone. Today is International Women's Talmud Day, and among the several organizations and many people marking it, we're also marking it at Drisha, where we have a lovely program today called Too Much Justice, the Beit Din Chavlanit. Everyone, we have the pleasure of learning today with three teachers: Rabbanit Leah Sarna, the director of our teen programs; Ms. Tzophia Stepansky, who is the summer middle school program director; and Ms. Elke Bentley, who is an alumna of both Drisha High School and Yeshiva Drisha. Today is going to be a interesting one. We have sources which will be shared on screen and in chat. I will get those shortly. To our illustrious teachers, good morning.
Hi, good morning. Thank you so much, Kayla. So everyone, just want to say a few extra words about this day and what it means for Drisha. So International Women's Talmud Day was founded by actually a Drisha High School program alumna named Rabbi Shana Kovlar. And we're just like so proud of all of our alumni and of all the hundreds of women Torah educators who have come through our programs, and we really feel that the revolution that is what we're celebrating today of women learning Talmud and having opportunities to teach Talmud at a very high level. In the United States, like Drisha really owns that legacy that our founding by Rabbi David Silver in the 1970s changed the world in this regard. And most of the English-speaking Talmud teachers in Israel studied in our institutions as well. And so we're so proud of Rabbi Shana for creating this day. And we're so proud of all of the women who have come through Drisha, who have taught and continue to teach Talmud at the highest levels that have ever happened in the history of the Jewish people. And so as our director of teen programs, I particularly feel connected to stay because Shana is one of our teen program alumni. Rabbi Shana is one of our teen program alumni, but also because it's a day to really, or at least the way I've interpreted it, it's a day for us to celebrate, and the past and the future of this project of women's Talmud study and teaching, and we've used it to give opportunities for teaching for some of our future budding scholars. So it's such a privilege to have Elke joining us, and Tzophia as someone who's a scholar in training at GPATS, and Elke who's a senior at Maimonides, my alma mater, and we're just so proud of what's coming out the pipeline also in terms of women's Talmud education. And we feel like Drisha is a huge part of that story, and we're just so proud of carrying that legacy. And the reason in particular why I invited Elke and Tzophia to be part of today's program is because when Shana reached out to me and said this year's topic is justice, I said, wow, I don't know anyone who loves Nezikin, which are the parts of the Talmud that are most concerned with justice, more than Elke and Tzophia. When Elke was in our program as a what was it, after her freshman year of high school, sophomore year, right? She was learning Sanhedrin on her own and had made like huge progress through it. And that summer, Tzophia was teaching Makot and Elke was in the class. And so now we're bringing you a sugya from Makot, a piece of the Talmud from Makot that Tzophia taught that summer. And we're so excited to bring you into one of what we think is one of the Talmud's most kind of fascinating conversations about justice. And it'll also give you just a little taste of kind of what's coming up the pipeline for the Jewish people, and what we do in our summer programs at Drisha. And we're just super excited to be here. So Tzophia, with that, take it away.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for coming today to learn. And thank you so much, Leah, for inviting me. So not only did I teach Masechet Makot that summer where Elke was in my shir, and it was a very, very exciting shir, lots of examples of different people murdering other people, running away. But I actually taught that summer Makot on the heels of learning Sanhedrin that past year in my learning program, GPATS, which is Yeshiva University's Talmud program for women post-college. And we actually learned this sugya. So I love this sugya. So, right, the topic is too much justice, the Beit Din Chavlanit. And our real sugya comes up in Masechet Makot in the first chapter. And I sort of want to frame the whole discussion that we're going to have by speaking about the Mishnah where this whole topic comes up bring up some of the issues, and then we're going to go more in depth about what's really lying behind each issue. And really, each opinion has such a different theory, perhaps, about how are we supposed to relate to creating justice in our society. Is it good to be punishing people? Is this a helpful thing? So with further ado, we're going to start with source number 1, the Mishnah Masechet Mako. So I'm going to hopefully be highlighting what I'm reading. So this is where it starts. Sanhedrin hahorege echad b'shavua nekret Chavlanit. When we have a Sanhedrin that kills once, Shavua typically we think of, a week. But really this is referring to the Shemitah cycle, which is a 7-year cycle. So a Sanhedrin that kills once every 7 years is considered Chavlanit. So we're definitely going to have to define that. We're going to define that later in this year. But even Chavala is to hurt someone, to injure someone. It's definitely a negative connotation of a word. So all we know, a Sanhedrin that kills once every 7 years, they're doing something bad, which is wild because if you think about it, our Torah is full of averot that people might commit. And it says, mot yumat, they have to die. So that's already a question we're going to really have to address. And also, by once every 7 years, sounds so random. Shemitah, Ma Kesher Bein Shemitah, Lahar Sinai comes up in this week's Parsha. What's the connection between 7 years and a base in Chavlanit? That's the first opinion of the Mishnah. And then the second one, which is even more cryptic, we have Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah Omer. No, it's not 7 years. Echad l'shivim shana, once every 70 years. So we have the first two opinions in the Mishnah. And one says, if you kill every 7 years, you're Chavlanit, the Beit Din, versus 70 years. So what's the significance between those particular numbers? And is the number 70 just saying we agree with the Tana Kama, just 7 years is a little too short, let's expand it to 70? And one of the ideas that we spoke about when I learned this in GPAT was maybe 70 is the average lifespan, as in no one should ever see more than once in their lifetime versus if it happened once every 7 years. But is this just saying we don't want people to be seeing this a lot? Where is this coming from? So, Rabbanit, Leah, and Elke, feel free to jump in if you have any thoughts of the difference between these two opinions.
And 70 could maybe also be just a stand-in number for like a lot or all even, right? Like if you speak 70 languages in the Midrash, that doesn't mean like literally 70 languages. It means like all languages or the biggest number of languages or something in that direction also.
So that'd be really interesting, Rabbanit Leah, because if it's true that we're just saying a hagzama, some sort of hyperbole. When we say 70, it's not literally 70, but a significant amount of time. It's so interesting because in our next opinion of the Mishnah, we'd have to figure out what the difference is between those two. So what happens in the next opinion, which is so wild, and Elke's going to start speaking about it really soon. And there's so much to unpack there, but Rabbi Tarfon, Rabbi Akiva Omrim. Rabbi Tarfon, Rabbi Akiva, they said, Ilu hayinu b'Sanhedrin. If we were on that Sanhedrin, lo neharag adam elam. We would have never killed anyone. So much going on. So number one, if it's true, Rabbanit Leah, that the opinion before is like once every almost never, like in a billion years, then what's the difference between Rabbi Tarfon or Rabbi Akiva saying, Lo neharag adam elam, we would never kill anyone? So maybe that highlights that the Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah didn't actually mean something that large, but really maybe it should be happening, just to very, very, very limited extent. And also, I guess a small side note, but something that I learned about in GPATs is, Ilu hayinu b'Sanhedrin. If we were on the Sanhedrin, what do you mean? We have a Gemara at the end of Masechet Mako. I guess sneak peek for the end of the Masechet we're talking about is Rabbi Akiva was by the Beit Mikdash, saw a fox running, and he starts laughing like, wow, if the Nevuot about destruction came true, even more so the ones about rebuilding. So Rabbi Akiva was there during the Chorban. He was alive at that time. So what does it mean if we were on the Sanhedrin? Rabbi Akiva, one of the most important Tanas, of course he would have been on the Sanhedrin. So something I remember learning about is perhaps they even started before the Chorban HaBayit. The Sanhedrin's powers in a way got revoked a little bit, that they weren't able to do based certain functions of the Beit Din, including mita, capital punishment. So maybe Rabbi Kiva and Rabbi Tarfon literally weren't even able to do it, even though they might have been on the Sanhedrin to some capacity. Besides that technical note, lo naraga dami olam. Does that mean they think that the whole Torah has all these aviro and it says a death penalty? Does that mean they think this is some ideal abstract concept, but it was never meant to go in practice? Is this an exaggeration? If it is, what's the difference between this and Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah? And just for the last opinion, the Mishnah, and this is a big pushback to Rabbi Tarfon and Rabbi Akiva, which sort of makes it seem like Rabbi Tarfon and Rabbi Akiva were really serious. They meant, we literally never want this to happen. Rabbi Shum ben Gamliel Omer, Af hein mar ben shofchi damim b'Yisrael. If that's true, you guys are going to increase the amount of murders in Bnei Yisrael, right? Because if there's no sense of justice and societal norms and punishment for the just consequences for what you're doing, there's going to be more havoc in the world. So when Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel says that, does he think we should have no mercy? Does it mean that he thinks we just don't like this idea of never killing anyone? So this is just the framing of the shir, and now we're going to unpack all the particular pieces in this Mishnah because there's a lot. So I'm going to pass it off to Elke.
On the opinion of Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Tarfon, that they would never kill anybody like ever if they were on the Beit Din. So the Gemara comments on this, and it says, Hechi avu abdi. Let's see. Hechi avu abdi. How would they do this? How could they justify not killing anybody ever? How would they do this? So Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Elazar damrit ravayu raitem trefa harag shalem harag. So Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Elazar, they both said that the way that Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Tarfon would do this is that they would say, they would ask the witnesses, did you see if the murder killed someone who was a treifa, so someone who has a condition like a physical condition that would lead them to die in the coming 12 months or less? Or did you see if they actually killed someone who was shalem, whole or intact? And what's the difference here? So if they killed someone if the murderer killed a victim who was a treifa, had the status of a treifa, so then the murderer wouldn't actually be eligible to get capital punishment because you killed someone, but they were gonna die anyways. So it's slightly different status. Amar Rav Ashi, im timse lomar shalem harag, dilma bevakom saif nekev hava. So Rav Ashi comes and he even explains more on this. And he says, if you wanted to say that they killed, if it comes out that they saw that the person was shalem or intact, fully whole, not having the status of a treifa, so then perhaps the place that the person got stabbed or mortally injured, this victim got mortally injured, maybe that's where the treifa was. Maybe that's where the perforation was, which is really interesting because the second that you say that, you're saying we can never know if this person was a treifa or if they were. So Rashi says on Im Timse Lomar Shalem Harag, so he's saying שיאמרו בדיקונו לאחר מיתתו מכל 18 טרפות. So Rashi's explaining what does it mean that we know that this person was a shalem, the murder victim was a shalem. So we say we checked him post-mortem for all the 18 types of treifa, which is interesting. Rashi's using an almost different definition of the word treifa here. The Gemara is using it as a status for a person. Rashi's using it as the actual injury or perforation or the actual thing that made this person into the status of a treifa that would be killing this person. So he's saying, no, we need to we would check him almost like an autopsy. We would check the victim if they had these 18 different types of treifa, which is really, really we're really checking this guy. And if we didn't find any, so then we would say like he was a shalim, like he was like whole or intact. So the Gemara comes back and he says, in the case of like someone committing erva or forbidden like sexual relations, specifically with a relative, how would they do this? How would they like? How would Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Tarfon make sure that like they wouldn't be killing people? So Abai and Rava both say that this is how they would do it. They would ask questions like, did you see this act? Literally like a brush going into a tube. Very, very graphic details. So we're asking like, did you see it? If you didn't, how do we know? Like, how do we know that it actually happened? So we're really, really trying to be makil here, like really like putting a emphasis on trying not to kill people, because who's going to see that? And then it goes on and it says, Rabbanan, like Chazal and the rabbis, they would go like Shmuel. And how would they go like Shmuel? So Shmuel holds slightly differently than Abai and Rava. He doesn't hold that you need to see it in graphic detail. He actually holds, no, like in the case of like, in this case, if the witness says like they have enough visual evidence, like then fine, we convict them as like, we convict these people as people who committed erba. You don't actually have to see this thing in like very graphic detail. So he's being a little bit less like, he's being a little bit more like severe in his interpretation. So,
and does that, like, how does that reflect, in your opinion, on like the definition of a Beit Din Chavlanit? Like if you lower the evidentiary standard, right?
Yeah, I mean, I guess Abai and Rava are really trying to be like, they're really trying not to kill anybody, and they're saying like Chavlanit is like the second you have more than like, the second you have a shadow of a doubt that this person could like require the death penalty, so then that's like Chavlanit. That's how I was interpreting it. But then Shmuel is saying like, no, you can have a small doubt. You don't need like such specific like evidence in that sense, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and it might result though in more killings, right? So it would lower the level, right? It would go back to that maybe like Rabbanan, Tanakama potentially position of Chavlanit of like once in 7 years as opposed to never.
Yeah,
maybe, at least potential rate.
No, yeah, I agree with that. That's
Also, another thought for question. One says of Rabbanan, how did they do this? One says that they follow just, I don't know, generally, does it look like they're committing erva, some sort of arayos? Is that the opinion of the Tanakama, do you think? Or the 1 in 70 years, or Rabban Gamliel? Like, which of, probably the Tanakama, but I don't know, what are your thoughts?
I mean, what you're saying about it being like the Tanakama, like it makes sense because you're kind of like what Leah was saying, like the Abai and Rava thing is really like trying not to kill anybody in 7 years. It's like it's very specific, like, and that's not going to happen as often as someone just thinking it. So this, yeah, I mean, it does sound like it's defending the Tanakama a little bit, that it's saying like, yeah, fine, maybe the Abai and Rava case won't happen so like often, but this case does happen often enough so that we would be killing people once in 7 years. Like it makes more sense with the Tanakama, I guess. But I would be interested to hear what you have to think about it. So I guess moving on a little bit to the Chidushei Ramban al Makot. So he's commenting on like the passage of, do you know if he killed a treifa or if he killed a shalim? Like, and that status difference. And he's saying you have to be very like didactic in this. You have to be very like precise, because if this is the case, so then he uses very strong language. You're uprooting the laws of like rotzchen, like murders, and the laws of edom zomim and what happens to them. like, you have to be very sure. But how are you like uprooting what would happen, like the laws of what would happen to a murderer, the laws of what would happen to an Eid Zomim or a scheming witness, like someone who's like a false witness? So he's saying that, like, if we're saying, right, that it's impossible for us to know if this person like had a treifa, because like we don't know if the like stab wound is where the treifa was, like we can never know if those Edom are Zomim, which is really, really interesting. You're saying like, you're not even talking about like, or the Ramban doesn't seem to be talking about like just the murder and getting the, like making sure that we're not like killing the murderer. He's talking about like the grander scheme of things almost. He's saying like, yeah, okay, fine. This, like, maybe you won't be doing this, but you're still disregarding this whole like slew of laws. And what's going to happen to these people? They're going to get away with being Edom Zomim. They're going to get away with like being scheming witnesses.
Witnesses.
Yeah, sorry. They're going to be like, they're going to get away with like doing this. How can we be saying this? Like, how can that be happening? And then he goes on and he says, furthermore,
Wait, Elke, I even wonder if this is like a Rabban Gamliel point of like, how are you letting all these people get away with it? Or maybe he's even saying, Akara Parshat Rotzchin, like you're just throwing away the Torah, right? The Torah gives
right,
these laws, and not just on a practical level, like this isn't good for society, people shouldn't get away with things, but the Torah outlined these things. They're meant to be real concepts that are supposed to actually happen. In a way, like you're going against maybe Ratzon Hashem by just being like, yeah, this part of the Torah, let's just erase it and throw it out of the garbage, which I feel like perhaps the Ramban's even saying that, which is even further.
So I think that's like definitely one piece. And then the other piece is, I think the Edom Zomim introduction here, like the scheming witnesses piece, is also so interesting. Because like, right, who's a scheming witness? So it's me and my friend, or we're men and we're kashal edus, whatever. Okay, fine. So we come and we say, oh, like we saw Tzophia like kill this person, right? And that means like we're trying to give Tzophia the death penalty. So if like killing doesn't get any punishment, then also Edom Zomim, like scheming witnesses, doesn't get any punishment either, because the punishment for Edom Zomim is the punishment we were trying to get for Tzophia. So it means not only have we like allowed there to be murders without consequence, but we've also then undermined the whole justice system, because now we allowed witnesses to just lie without consequence. So it like really blows it up beyond just like, oh, the world of like murder or people doing bad things, but like, oh, now there's not even a point in there being a justice system if you're not going to have consequences for things, because then the safety valve on the justice system, which are the rules about false witnessing, all of a sudden have no consequences either.
yeah, no, it's like it's interesting because you're like putting like almost on a scale, you're saying like, okay, fine, we really don't want to kill this person, right? We really don't want to give anybody the death penalty. But when does that, I mean, kind of like the title of the class, when does that become too much? When are we going too far? When are we saying like that, you know, just so that we don't give the death penalty to this one person, which is very, very important, we're just gonna, like, does that mean that we get to go that far? Like, is anything like too much to like save this murderer's life if we like really suspect that he did it? No. But yeah, so he's like really saying, where were we? Like so he's saying like, you're throwing out this entire thing of Edom Zomim. And then he goes on and he says something really, really interesting. He says, מעולם לא עלה על דעת שנבדוק אותם בטרפות שאינו ניכר מבחוץ. Right? He's going on and he's saying, like, this whole thing about internal trefot, like that, like, he's going to quote Rashi in a second, but like, just going back for a second, even before he quotes it, Rashi's saying, like, you need to like do kind of like an autopsy like procedure. You need to like really, really internally check, did this person have any treifa of the 18 treifa? Like really be medactic in this. And he's saying like, that was never the intention. That is too much. The second, like you're cutting up a body and looking for treifa, that's too much. You can't do that. And we're really only looking for like what's nikal mibachutz, like what you can see from the outside, that this guy is a treifa. Like you're walking down the street, you know, oh, this guy's a treifa, this guy's not a treifa. You know, like we're not actually doing this.
I even wonder, are you allowed to cut open the body to do an autopsy? We have this idea that people have made. You can't just do things to people's bodies willy-nilly. So I even wonder if it's like, well, we'll never know, according to Shita Rashi.
Yeah. I mean, especially with the fact that like, I'm like presuming Rashi is going with like the fact that like, or the opinion that like, okay, the stab wound could be where the treifa was, which is really like, so then you're really, really saying like, you'll never know.
If I recall correctly, and it's been a long time, but I believe that the halachic literature about autopsy like quotes that Rashi and like engages with it.
Oh,
just for the record. Yeah.
Oh, that's really cool. That's really cool. But like, he's saying like, yeah, I mean, you'll never know. And what's like kind of interesting, but kind of like a little bit of side note, but a little bit not, in like the laws of kashrut, we don't hold like that. We don't hold that, oh, maybe the treifa was where we shechted the animal. No, we just say like, fine, we don't see a treifa, we don't see a treifa. So like, we're really like, this even fits even better with this, because it's saying like, if you don't see it from the outside, we're not going to be like doing potential nivel mace. We're not going to do that. Then he quotes Rashi and he says like, he's quoting and he's saying, we would check from the inside, like we were just saying. And then he uses like kind of harsh language. He says, he's just like, no, it can't be right. It's not right, because that would mean that you're, again, throwing out all of these like different laws. And like Tzophia was saying, you're kind of like chucking out whole sections of the Torah. Okay, so now we have Tosfot. Wait, I'm hearing that my camera is off. Is it back on now?
Yes.
Okay, cool. Okay, here we go. Tosfot on this Gemara. So in the middle of like a pretty long Tosfot, we have like this really interesting thing where they're saying the language of lo neherag adam me'olam. If we remember from the Mishnah, Rabbi Tarfon and Rabbi Akiva said, like, if we were on the Beit Din, they used the words lo neherag adam me'olam. We would never kill anybody. And they're saying, like, it's not actually like that precise language. It doesn't mean like we would never do it. It's just like most of the time we wouldn't kill anybody. And why? Because they would ask so many questions and they would be so medactic in their questions that it would be impossible for like the two witnesses to not undermine each other's testimonies. It would like, or almost impossible. Maybe like if like both witnesses really saw in like really, really distinct detail, they would be saying like exactly the same thing over and over again. But like, how often is that going to happen? Which again ties in more with the Shivim Shana interpretation than the Sheva Shanim, because like, again, it's not going to happen. Like, that never happens. And Tosfot goes on in a different Tosfot.
Also says though, like rov pamim specifically, like there is the potential, which means it won't be okay. But right. Rov pamim, does that mean that it'll happen once every 7 years versus 70, or just means that only 5% of the time? Like I even wonder what percent, where that even goes on the spectrum of how much or how little is happening.
Right. Yeah. No, that's really interesting, especially like the part that you said about like rov pa'amim is kind of like almost directly addressing what the Ramban is saying, like, what, you're never going to kill anybody, you're being okay, all these things. So fine, rov pa'amim, maybe like most of the time, like there's still a possibility, but it's a very like small possibility.
And the other piece that like drives those numbers is how many murder cases are even brought before the Beit Din, which is something we'll talk about in source 6 or 7 or so, right? Is like, yeah.
And even in source 5 kind of brings that up a little bit more. They're talking now, Tosfos commenting on the thing, like about Arayos and Erva. Like, you need to see this in like very graphic detail. So now they're talking about, they bring up, well, how can this be? Like in the Ovid Avodah Zarah and the Machal Shabbos, we don't have these stringencies on like witnessing the act of someone being Machal Shabbos or Ovid Avodah Zarah. So how can we say that the person would never be killed? Because we're talking about Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Tarfon, who said this person would never be killed, and they would ask this question. But the stringency doesn't hold for all cases. And the Tosfot answers with one answer, and it says like, okay, fine, yeah, maybe like we won't have these exceptions for like Ovid Avodah Zarah and Machal Shabbos, but they're rare, unlike the cases of murder and adultery, which kind of sounds counterintuitive, like especially like in modern day, like really are these cases so much less uncommon? But yeah, I guess that tells us more about like the number of murder cases and adultery cases that were going before the Sanhedrin at this time.
Which is so interesting, especially if this was around the Horban, right? Because we have Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Tarfon. And I mentioned how really just, I think it might have been 40 years or something before the Horbans, when they weren't allowed to do all these capital punishments. Like Dafka, the Horban time when society was so corrupt, right? We see in the beginning of Yeshayahu, like, we don't care about, I mean, it's a different base of Mikdash, but God doesn't care about the korbanos you give, but really how you're treating people, right? And so I wonder if maybe they were like so from, quote unquote, keeping Shabbos, not doing Avodah Zarah, like, being out on L'Chavero, throw that out the window.
Yeah.
I think that does really line up, right? Our understanding that like the first Beit HaMikdash was destroyed for Avodah Zarah, but the second Beit HaMikdash was destroyed for Ben Adam L'Chavero, and this really like ties into that. It's the interpersonal avirut that were rampant, but the avirut between a person and God, like, oh, those are so rare, we don't even have to think about those.
Yeah, almost like those cases aren't just like rare, they're almost like less important in this case because we're not going through all of these, like, I don't know, all of these like complicated ways to like get people out of them. Like, really what we're looking at is Ben Adam L'Chavero.
Also, one other point, sorry to interrupt, but it's so interesting when he says that maybe when it comes to Avodah Zarah breaking Shabbat, like, it wasn't so common, which means if, God forbid, someone were to break Shabbos, they wouldn't try and go through all these loopholes. There's no incentive for them to try and opt out of it because it didn't happen so often. But when it came to really common cases, we don't want to kill out 10% of Klal Yisrael who are doing all these averos of Ritzicha and things that have to do with Arayos. That makes it seem like, once again, like more than one person is being killed, which is so interesting because based off the Pshat, it seems like they're the most extreme opinion of no one's ever being killed, Leola. But if this is true, like, maybe this is even more than once every 7 years, which is just interesting.
Yeah, and I think that really ties into what Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel was saying about, like, yeah, you're being Marvim Shlichet Damim the Yisrael, right? Like, you're letting all these people go and they will murder people. You know, like, this isn't just like some uncommon once in 7 years, once in 70 years occurrence. But the Tosfot gives another answer. And it's really interesting what the Tosfot does here, because the Gemara is talking about, like, okay, did the murder victim have a treifa, right? Because that would absolve the murder from the death penalty. Now the Tosfot saying, no, we're going to talk about the perpetrator. Did the perpetrator have a treifa? Not just of the murder, but also of Avodah Zarah and also Machal Shabbos. Because if you're doing like a crime that warrants capital punishment, like any of these crimes, like Avodah Zarah, Machal Shabbos, murder, Arayos, whatever, if you have a treifa, you're not eligible to get capital punishment. So he's flipping kind of the Gemara's logic, or mirroring it almost. And he's saying, like, we just, like, this is how you would do it. Like, you would just say, maybe the person has a treifa. And then, like, we're not cutting open a live person because that's not what we do. So you're just saying, yeah, we'll never know. We'll never know. Which, like, again, that's kind of like counterintuitive. Because, like, what are you doing when you're saying that? You're just checking everything out. You're just being like, whoops. Doesn't matter in some senses that, like, they could be murderers. And it doesn't matter that they could be, like, doing all these sins. Maybe with Avodah Zarah and Machal Shabbos, a little less, like, physically damaging to society. But, like, still, you're letting people get away with all these crimes. And just to go back to what the Ramban was saying, like, how is this not being, like, ma'aker some, like, very fundamental, like, values and just, like, klalim in the Torah and, like, mitzvot. But then, like, just to finish up the opinion of Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Tarfon. So, the Mishnah in Sanhedrin Parakeh, Mishnah Bet, is saying, Kol amar b'bdikot harei zeh meshubach. So anybody who, like, or all the judges who are mar b'bdikot, who do a lot of examinations of their witnesses, is, like, that's meshubach, that's praiseworthy. So, and then what does this mean? What exactly does this mean, mar b'bdikot? So we're saying, an example of this, ma'aseh uvadak ben zakai be'uktzei te'enim. So there's an incident where Ben Zakkai was examining his witnesses and he was questioning them about, like, the stems of figs. Now, what this means, whether, like, it's supposed to be a metaphor for, like, the uktei te'enim are so small and he was being really nitpicky, like the uktei te'enim, or he was literally questioning them about, like, okay, what color was the uktei te'enim? What color were the stems of figs? What was the size? What was this? What was this? And, like, whether the uktei te'enim were, like, part of the case. Either way, like, it's showing, like, he's really being medoctic here. This is not just some, like, vague questions. And that's, like, meshubah. We like that. That's important for us as a society. And with that, I think I will pass it on to Rabbanit Leah.
Yeah. All right. So, right, we just talked about, like, okay, Rabbi Tarfon and Rabbi Akiva's opinion seems wild. But Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel, his clapback is really harsh, right? Like, oh, if we don't prosecute anyone and we don't ever put anyone to death, then, like, the society will fill with murderers and rapists, which, like, I don't know, sounds like just like fear mongering and ridiculous overstatement, right? So what are we afraid of? And the Mishnah really says, yeah, in fact, like, that is straight, like, what Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel is afraid of. That's just a thing that happened. And it had, you know, the Mishnah in Sota is telling us about the halachic ramifications of that societal shift. So, right, it's just telling us, you know, Misha Rabu Harat Chanim, when there were so many murders, when murders proliferated. So then, like, there's no point in Agla Arufa anymore. Where there's just this ritual where, like, if we find someone who was murdered, but we don't know who did it, then there's, like, this whole thing. And they're like, yeah, there's no point in doing that anymore. And similarly, Misharabu Haminafim, right? When there were so many adulterers, then there's no point in Sota anymore. And in fact, we have, like, a takana to that effect by Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, who seems to have gotten rid of Sota altogether, because, like, if men are committing adultery too, then why are we putting women through this whole thing? But like, what you have here, there's a lot of interesting things going on in this Mishnah, but what I'm interested in is particularly the piece about just this idea of, like, the Mishnah telling this history of, like, oh yes, this is, like, a thing that happened. So exactly what Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel is worried about, we see other places in the Mishnah, like, yes, this has already come to pass. So what does that mean, right? Like, does that mean that Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Tarfon, like, their vision of a Beit Din is actually what happened? Does it mean, is it a criticism, as Tzophia pointed out, like, the Sanhedrin had stopped being allowed to try capital cases, and are they saying, yeah, you stopped us from trying capital cases. And this is what happened. Like a really serious thing happened because of that. But then Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Tarfon are kind of in the abstract saying like, oh, you know, maybe this is a good thing, versus Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel who's looking around and saying, guys, this is a disaster. And it sort of seems like the Mishnah in Sota is on Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel's team. So we'll just look at some kind of classical parshanu on the Mishnah and on Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel. Interestingly enough, and the Meiri is going to point this out, the Gemara doesn't go into Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel's opinion. There's no Gemara kind of doing a back and forth about it. There's no Shakavatari about it, which is really, really interesting. And the Meiri is going to say, yeah, the Gemara doesn't go into it because we just paskin like Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel, as if it's like a thing to paskin about, which is also kind of like a funny idea. Like, oh yes, our Mishnah does contain a three-way machloket, but like, is there any like practical halacha to come out of it? And the Meiri says like, yes, and we hold like Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel that like capital punishment is a good thing and we should not hold back from it, apparently, is the Meiri's opinion. And why does he say that? He says, just as it is super important to be able to save innocent people, which is why we need to preserve Eidim Zomanim, by the way, which has like been the like secondary conversation we've been having all along here. So too is a mitzvah to do capital punishment and kill people who are obligated to be killed. Where does he get that out from? From one of the refrains of Sefer Devarim, Ubi'arta harami kirbacha, burning out the bad from your midst, which is a topic we'll be learning about this summer in the Drisha summer high school and middle school programs. Right, burning out the bad from your midst, Ubi'arta harami kirbacha. What do you think that means, says the Meiri, other than have capital punishment and do it appropriately? That is a mitzvah in the Torah, says the Meiri. And it's a psak, says the Meiri, of the Gemara on this Mishnah. The Tiferet Yisrael B'Yachim says a little bit more softly. He says, if you don't kill anyone, this is kind of the obvious read. No one's going to be afraid, right? They'll just kill people willy-nilly. But here's where he says, where it gets a little stronger. Even if you put them into prison, or if you send him over to secular authorities, it's still Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel Svirle Shemizat Lo Yitera Haroteh. Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel holds it doesn't matter, even if you live in a state where they have capital punishment, if it's not coming from the Beit, it's not going to discourage someone from being an adulterer or a murderer. They will not fear the judgment of secular authorities, which is, first of all, like so interesting. It makes all kinds of really fascinating assumptions about maybe like corruption in the secular legal system, or like how the Machta works. So that's like a whole other just like note here on the side. But really this idea that people should fear Beit Din, and that's what's going to maintain a just society. And the only way to do that is for the Beit Din to have capital punishment capabilities. Tzophia, yeah.
Like, do you think that this is saying specifically it's through the Beit Din the capital punishment is what scares them? Or do you think it's saying capital punishment is what scares them, but keep a jail or some other maybe fine that comes through Dina de Malchuta, Dina is not going to scare them. Like when it says Dina de Malchuta, that doesn't have to mean capital punishment. It might
right. So it could be if you live somewhere where there isn't capital punishment. That could be it. I guess my reflection is that in a lot of the places that Jews lived, including where Tiferet Yisrael was, I think, Jews had the ability to find their own constituents and all of that, but they were not allowed to do capital punishment, and that was reserved for secular authorities. And so I my feeling is like, oh, like what is for that? Like that is capital punishment in a lot of ways, but I think that's what I just said is obviously a very complicated thing to say, and I'm not sufficiently an expert in the Tiferet Yisrael to know that that's what he means.
It's like that makes sense, I guess, historically. A few summers ago, I learned in Rabbi Clapper's Baby Drash, and we spent the whole summer learning about Dina de Malchuta, and seems majority of the time refers to monetary things. So I just wonder if that's just a stam phrase being used that sparked in the Gemara, he really means something more monetarily. Because if so, that makes a lot of sense that, yes, jail or money thing, of course, that's not going to scare you the same way as death penalty.
Totally.
It makes so much sense.
But let's look at the Rambam, because we have to understand what we mean by jail and monetary fines. So the Rambam says, okay, let's imagine a world in which, like, yes, the evidentiary standards of Beit Din, even without Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Tarfon's like fancy B'dikot and all of that, like, even put that to the side, just normal standard understanding of Beit Din's evidentiary standards are extremely high. So you could have like lots of murderers who just like the Beit Din can't put them to death. And so a king is allowed to act beyond the Beit Din. So if a king feels like this person has to die, even if a Beit Din can't find them guilty, then a king has the ability to do that. Takanat ha'olam harishut biyado. He's allowed to, a Jewish king is allowed to perfect society. Permission is in hand. And even the Rambam even says, a Beit Din can actually override their own evidentiary standards as a horat sha'ah, as like an immediate fiat, if they thought that was necessary. But interestingly, let's say they didn't do it, and there wasn't like the Beit Din determined that there isn't like a necessity for horat sha'ah, but you still have like pretty clearly a murderer who isn't getting the justice that seems right. What are they supposed to do? You're supposed to beat them within an inch of death, says the Rambam. And when you put them in jail, they're supposed to really suffer for a really long time, and you're supposed to like discomfort them in every kind of discomfort. What's the point of that? Not really, right? It's not really at all. This is also an interesting conversation that's going on in the back here, is like, what is punishment for? Is punishment for the person that like we're trying to get you to like do tshuva and live out your suffering in this world so that maybe in the next world you'll have kapara or something like that? That does not seem to be the case in this entire conversation. And Rambam says it really explicitly. And Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel, this is a really piece of this that's driving him, is that a big piece of punishing one person is deterrent for other people. It seems like for Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel, right? Oh, if you don't give people the death penalty, there'll be lots of people who do all these crimes, meaning, and I think the Rambam's giving a really clear read of that, the point of the death penalty is deterrent for other people. Right? The point is, right? The point is, it should be strike fear and awe into the hearts of other wicked people, so that this death should not be a stumbling block and a snag for them, causing them to say, let me arrange and I'll have my enemies kill the way so-and-so did, and then I won't suffer the consequences, just like my friend didn't suffer any consequences over there. So for Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel, just to summarize, it seems like the point is that giving people a death penalty is a deterrent. The Meiri understands it to be a mitzvah in the Torah to give people a death penalty. And so not only is it like a really important thing to do because it's a mitzvah, but because it effectuates a deterrent, a fix for society, all of that, it seems to be that's what's motivating Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel. Okay, over to Tzophia.
Sophia, you're muted.
I just realized, it probably seemed so funny. So everyone's really set up all the different parts of the sugya, but the most important part that I mentioned when we read the Mishnah is, what are we like upset about the Beit Din? Like, what's this Chavlanit? What exactly is the terrible thing that they're doing, right? We spoke about different theories of maybe the extent of the justice system, but what about that makes it particularly a Chavlanit of a Beit Din? So in the Gemara opens up. I mean, we went through majority of the Gemara, but this is the beginning part where it says about the debate between the Tanna Kama and Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, when we have that debate. So Ibailahu, the Gemara asks the question, when we said, right, we have the Tanna Kama says, if you kill once every 7 years, they're Chavlanit. But now Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah says, no, every 70 years. When he says every 70 years, does he think the threshold of what makes the Beit Din like they're doing Chavalah is that they've killed once every 70 years? Oh, Dilmar, perhaps, or Arahi. Or maybe like he's saying, no. if it happens once every 70 years, they're not bad, they're not Chavlanit, they're not doing something wrong. And that's just the normal amount that they're supposed to be killing. So the Gemara says, Heku. It's actually so interesting, just like the Meiri poskin about Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel. I'm pretty sure the Meiri also poskins on this sugya, saying that it's, I'm pretty sure, every 70 years. So very interesting Meiri to be poskening a bunch on this sugya, especially when the Gemara, at least here, says Teku. That's just a small side note. So it's unclear. Do we think that there is a threshold that is normal and justifiable? 70 years is okay, and 7 years is problematic, or maybe 7 years is also Chavlanit. And if it's true that if it's once in 70 years, it's Chavlanit, what about it is so bad? So it's so interesting. If we look at the Rambam on his Pirush HaMishnayot, he says, Ra'oi she'kavnu haSanhedrin zeh behitbonenut umatun b'dinim. The Rambam is describing like the Beit Din, they're supposed to have they're supposed to really think about it deeply, and they're not supposed to rush to decision. And we see in some of the Mishnayot that they were supposed to fast the night before, spend all night thinking about it. It's a very serious thing at hand, very high stakes. There's no going back. They're supposed to really be thinking really intensely. And if they're not able to, so if they spent all this time thinking and they're not able to think of any loophole for this person, then they should actually fall through the seidut and assume the person did it, and they should kill them. And this is the crazy part. Afilu elef ish b'yom echad. Even if there's 1,000 people that need to be killed in one day, you're allowed to do that. Ra'oi al pi Torah. You're supposed to do that. Which the Rambam, the way he's seeing it, seems like it's not inherently the end result of having people being killed and capital punishment being doing the actual process of it, but it's really putting the Chavlanit on the Beit Din. If they're not doing their proper job, then they're really being mechabel. They're really hurting people unnecessarily because they're supposed to be taking these intense high precautions. So that's what the Rambam and then also the Bartanura say on the Mishnah.
But I do think it's so interesting because, if you ask Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi, it seems like, right, the Rambam's getting at, there's this epistemological problem. How can you know that this thing happened? And Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Tarfon say, yeah, and we could ask you questions until it becomes clear that you actually don't know. And the Rambam's saying, I reject that conclusion. I think you can think about it, you can ask the right questions, and you can come to an honest conclusion that this can be known, and then you just have to follow it, no matter where that takes you.
Right. Which really does make sense if you look at Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Tarfon's opinion of the Gemara. Did you see this exact detail? Or is this person shalem? I feel like you can know that this event happened. Someone murdered someone without knowing that they put the sword in a particular place where the person was already sick. That's beyond a reasonable doubt. And something a lot of the Rishonim speak about is we have this concept of rove. Most people we're not assuming are walking around their tree float, they're going to pass away in the next year. That's just factually incorrect. So it's really bolsters the fact it's really possible to do it. We're not trying to ask people these crazy questions, especially with Tosfot. Is the murderer themselves, are they a shalem or a treifa? Those are such far-fetched questions. And the Yachen, so that's very Israel, he uses extremely sharp language. Because what's Chavlanit? Mashchetet. They're literally destroying. Shemechabel meshachete haolam. Not only are they being mechabel people, but they're destroying the whole world. Right? And there's a Mishnah in Sanhedrin speaks about you kill a person, you've killed a whole world. Right? And they're not doing yeshiva ha'olam. They're not expanding the world. They're really undoing it. Especially if a whole human being has a whole life, generations that could come from them, they're really being mechabel and destroying the world by, I guess, very often killing people. And so the Meiri, a different part of the Meiri where he doesn't poskin, but he says, very similar to the Rambam, Sharu Shenam Chukrim Vodkim Yafeh. Right? It's saying it's the Beit Din's fault, it's Beit Din's fault. But so far, the Rambam, and I didn't put the Bartanura on, and the Meiri, it seems to be really focused on the procedure part of the Beit Din. They're just not, I guess, when they're doing the din, maybe they're not thinking clearly enough. They're not taking the proper legal precautions from going step A. Well, what about this detail and that detail and that detail? So when it says Chavlanit, they're responsible for these murders. They're being mashchetet ha'olam, but it's not. But it's more in that particular case, they're doing something wrong. But the Aruch HaShulchan HaAtid, which is one of my favorite sources, I quote it around once every month, sometimes every 2 months, brings it so much larger. It's not just in that particular case, they're not taking proper precautions, or not even, he goes even further than saying maybe they're not valuing human life enough by not taking it so seriously. He says something much larger, which really highlights what is the role of the Beit in society. Are they just arbiters of halacha, or is their role something more? So what does he say? Right, they're supposed to really sit there and think it out. Klamar, what does that mean? Afal God, even though any case they need to really think through things. Right, once they know the din, you're supposed to paskin like that immediately. Aval, the dinei nefashot is going to be different than regular dinei mamano, where you're just supposed to think through all the technicalities and paskin it. But dinei nefashot ain't okay. That's not true. It's not just, okay, we've gone through it and it seems like this is the pshat, they're supposed to kill someone. They're supposed to spend even more time thinking through it, right? And there's another, the first mission in the 6th parak of Sanhedrin speaks about if someone's already paskin to get skila, and they're like bringing him to the makom where he's going to be pushed off for a skila. If someone says, I have an idea, you bring him back to the Beit Din, retry it again multiple times. Like, even if we have a psak, we don't say, well, this is the psak, we're moving along, but we try so hard to make this person zakai. But katov od, and not only that, the kol Beit Din sharag nefesh b'sheva shanim hare'ilim Chavlanit al kal shano. So he Mishnah Sof Parak Kama Dmako Bahaki Pirsho, and this is how we should explain the whole Mishnah, the broader theme of the Mishnah. The Beit Din Shemashkecha al Yisrael. A Beit Din is that's supposed to be watching over Bnei Yisrael. Tzrichim lerot, they're supposed to see Shelo Yikra Nevelo Keilu. They're supposed to look at what's happening in society. What's happening in Bnei Yisrael? Are these nevelot, these terrible things happening? Like, clearly, look at society. They're degrading. That's their job, to be mashkiach ruchani, or physically. They're supposed to be looking over Bnei Yisrael and seeing this is happening. Klamar, that means to say, they're not doing their job because they're not being proper spiritual leaders. It's up to them. If they're starting to see this pattern that there's so many murders going around, it's on them to step up and say, what are broader societal changes that we can do? So it's not just in that particular case, if they came to the decision to carry out capital punishment. He's not focusing on that at all, which the Rambam, the other Rishonim were saying. For them, they're like, they just didn't do a good job in that particular case. Mashma, if they would have done a good job, it's fine. But no, there's a much larger structural infrastructure problem that's going on. And that's what's Chavlanit. Not this case, but their whole role in general, their whole status of this Beit Din, something's bad with it. And really, that makes so much sense of mashchetet ha'olam, right? They're not doing a good job making sure society is good. They're really part of this. And just to highlight, I guess, the whole idea of the Aruch HaShulchan HaAtid, it's such a big deal. They have to be doing this hashgacha. And I guess all these are shown of, really, we don't really just want to be killing people so quickly. That is like, even if we follow Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel, he just is saying we don't want murders in the world. But it's always really important to remember another Mishnah, Masechet Sanhedrin. Rabbi Meir says, "B'shash adam mitza'er shchina malashon omeret kivyachol kaleni miroshi." When a person is suffering, it's as if God Himself is. God is like resting His head down. Kaloni mizari, and God is so sad. Imkain hamakom mitza'er al damam shel rishaim, and God's even sad when rishaim, evil people, are in pain. Shenishbach kal v'chomer al damam shel tzadikim. So even people who are innocent, God is crying, is so sad. And so important to remember, even if someone might have done something that gives them the status of being a Rasha, God's so sad. And perhaps that's why this whole system, we want to have these bidukot, we want to make people zakai, but really, not only we practically don't want this to happen so much, and it could be that really you're supposed to do your proper job as the Beit Din, go through it, and maybe you could do capital punishment. We have to remember, as a society, we don't want to get to that place or even have to go through that process where we potentially could be killing Elef Anashim b'chol yom, 1,000 people a day. That means there's a broader problem, and not just it's this individual and that individual. And we have to try and create this society that has this justice, even though there might be a particular case where we have to do it. So thank you so much, everyone, for learning with us. And if anyone has any other comments, feel free to share. But it's after 12:30. Don't you feel?
Yeah.
Today.
Thank you so much to Tzophia and to Elke. We can stick around for a couple minutes now. I've been informed we have to get off by 12:40 at the absolute latest, but we can stick around for a few minutes. People want to come off, ask questions. There's just so much interesting material, I feel, that has been covered. So just as like a recap of things in case you had a question before, but maybe forgot it in the meanwhile, because like so many different things have been said. We saw the opening Mishnah, we saw Elke present sources about the opinion of Rabbi Kiva and Rabbi Tarfon, where they're really trying to say, oh, like capital punishment exists in the Torah. How would we get rid of it? We would just ask so many questions and about in such great in like impossible detail and raise the evidentiary standard so high that it would be impossible for anyone to fulfill. And then we saw a question like, well, would that be possible for people who violate Shabbat? What about people who do idolatry? And then we also saw sources about Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel, who says, yeah, like this is like we actually need capital punishment because it serves as an important deterrent. We saw maybe it's a mitzvah of capital punishment, and that actually it's like just as important to have innocent people not be killed. It's equally as important to kill guilty people. And that it's also important because it creates justice in the world. And then we saw at the end, well, like pushback potentially on Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel. Maybe there's another way to create justice in the world. Maybe we can create systemic justice in the world. And that if you have that many capital cases, there's something going wrong. And the Beit Din should have been involved in that from the get-go, and the Beit Din shouldn't just be reactive as if like, oh, our only tool to address societal ills is capital punishment, as opposed to saying, no, like we're the Beit Din. We should be helping people so that they're not so desperate, maybe, that they're killing people or whatever else it is. Okay, so with a little bit of recap, hopefully that sparked questions for people, if you have any.
I know there were some good questions coming up in the chat.
Rella, do you have a question? Were you raising your hand?
No, I just want to highlight some questions that came up in the chat earlier, but people who actually have a question, you should unmute yourself and speak out.
Thanks.
In
All right,
chat,
go for it.
Sure. In chat, this is coming from earlier in class, but ML noted that Chana spoke on Chavlanit as a third marriage.
Yeah, so that's a reference to like if you have a woman whose like husbands keep dying, right? That's what we're talking about here. And then so she becomes like an Isha Chavlanit. Like she's like that's like a really complicated text. I think we need a whole cheer on that to understand what it means that like a woman could be called like a destructive woman. You know, whenever there's texts like that just seem like so difficult to square with like as women learners of texts, I always like to really like, you know, like take our time with those and look at them in their full full context. So if either of my co-panelists have thoughts on that, you're welcome to share, but I would in general say like, let's take a deep look at that some other time together.
Another comment is that Ruben Stepansky highlighted, I wonder if there's a philosophical connection of 70 to the 70 years of Galut.
Tzophia, you want to take that?
Yeah, I feel like that is a prime time where you have 70, and I guess Abba or Mr. Stepansky. Do you think that maybe because there's something like you're missing, you're not in your full good state if you're having that? I got a nod. Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. Good point, Mr. Stepansky.
I do like that idea though. And I think at maybe 70 as like then a unit of like a coherent unit of time, or maybe like a whole generation or a whole lifespan, and that being kind of what the length of the like the historic length of galut also is maybe representative of. And I couldn't say like which direction it comes in. Like maybe 70 came to represent that in Judaism, like because that was the length of the galut, and then it was like, oh yes, like what is like a unit? A unit is 7. You know, I don't know. And we obviously like 7s, as Tzophia pointed out from the start also. And 10s, and then 70 is like 7 and 10. Yeah. Yes. How long it takes for a carob tree to fruit, totally. All right, Kayla, what else you got for us?
What else do I have? Let's see. From Nikki Halpern, when they appear to the witnesses, points out another layer of interpretation and cultural/social diversity.
Yeah, I like that. I mean, that ties into what I was saying about epistemology. So epistemology is the philosophy of how we know things, just a big word. But I think what Nikki's bringing in is, right, we always have a critique of, you know, what is seeing? And when I see things, that's culturally informed. And that's a big danger in all witnessing, right? Is like, when I see things, like, did I really see it? Did my brain fill in gaps that then were just assumptions I was making because of all our culture and society? And so that's always like a big risk, and something we think about in justice today a lot as well, obviously. I don't know if other people, if Elke or Tzophia want to chime in on that, like just like the dangers of actually like of eyewitnessing in general.
Yeah, I majored in psychology in college. So we definitely spent a lot of time in cognitive psychology, specifically speaking about how memory is so fickle and we remember things we want to, and very often we'll remember one detail, or we assume we were going to see something. Where like you'll have 2 pictures of people, or like one of these is the suspect, and people are like, yeah, it was totally that person, but it wasn't. So it's definitely very fickle.
And then also the ability by questioners to plant this, especially there's like a lot of research about this with child witnesses, that people are suggestible. So if you say like, you know, like you can ask a question, and then all of a sudden it'll like be put back into someone's memory, even if it wasn't there. And you have to be super careful how you like get information. A lot of the research I've seen about it is mostly with children, but I think I've always been convinced that adults also are really suggestible.
Research is also for adults.
And then the question is, right, like kol amar b'bediko, right? That's the Mishnah that the last thing that Elke read. Right, adding in these questions, it's like, well, if the questions themselves might lead you to misremember, then maybe more questions, as opposed to just these fewer open-ended questions where someone's just talking instead of you guiding them, might actually be a better avenue to justice. It's also like an interesting critique there.
All right. Thank you, everyone. There were more questions in chat, but as we're running a little bit low on time, I'm going to have to say thank you for contributing, and we're sorry I couldn't bring them up. Thank you, everyone, for joining. It's been another wonderful Women's Day of Talmud. Have a good day. Have a good evening, wherever you are.
Shkaya.